The grey saturation of the afternoon of November 24th, 1971. Thanksgiving Eve in Portland, Oregon. A fine mist covered the asphalt, and the international airport breathed the slow, almost tedious rhythm of an approaching holiday. On that day, Northwest Orient Airlines Boeing 727-100, tail number N467 US, was preparing for routine flight 305, a 30-minute hop to Seattle-Tacoma. At 2:50 p.m., a man who identified himself at the counter as Dan Cooper bought a one-way ticket, paying in cash, the cost of $18.50. He was an anomaly in the line. No one remembered what most people wore, but Cooper stood out for his deliberate lack of distinction. A cheap, black executive suit, slightly tight in the shoulders, an impeccable white shirt, and a dark, thin tie, meticulously tightened. He wore thick, dark glasses, a strange detail for a terminal with little natural light. His only notable accessory was a dark brown executive briefcase. Cooper was calm, silent. He moved with the precision of someone who had timed every step of that day in his mind. He boarded in the smoking section, seat 18C, in the rear of the aircraft. At 3:15 p.m., Flight 305 took off. Cruising altitude was reached quickly. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner, walking down the aisle, noticed the man in 18C beckoning her with an almost imperceptible nod. He was holding the brown briefcase and smiled politely as he handed her a folded piece of paper. Schaffner presumed it was just a phone number or a flirtatious note, the kind of tired annoyance that came with the job. She put the note in her skirt pocket, preparing to move on. Cooper spoke, his voice low, emotionless, but with a cold authority that made her stop. "Miss, you'd better read this. I have a bomb." The smile on the flight attendant's face disappeared. She sat in the vacant seat next to him and unfolded the note, written in blue, felt-tip pen. The handwriting was uniform, blocky, almost printed. The words were direct. She didn't need to read the line that threatened the flight. She saw the briefcase partially open. Inside, arranged in neat rows, were 8 red cylinders, connected to a large, probably 9-volt battery, with wires tangled around the structure. One didn't need to be an expert to understand that, regardless of the artifact's functionality, Cooper intended for her to believe. Her heart raced, but her training spoke louder. She looked at the passenger who called himself Cooper, observing him with a new forensic intensity. The black, neatly cut hair that looked oily under the cabin light. The tanned skin, perhaps from excessive exposure to wind, not sun. He wasn't sweating, he was in total control. Cooper demanded 4 things: $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 2 complete sets of main parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes, a fuel truck waiting in Seattle, and the guarantee that the FBI knew nothing until he landed. The parachute demand was the detail that changed the criminal calculation. This was not a common hijacking for political or financial ransom. It was an escape plan, designed with a specificity that suggested a cold, perhaps even military mind. The flight attendant, now transformed into an intermediary between the hijacker and the outside world, was sent to the cockpit with the demands. Dan Cooper had initiated what would become the greatest unsolved criminal legend in the United States. He was about to evaporate into the air of the Pacific Northwest, taking the money and the pseudonym with him. The Northwest Orient Airlines Boeing 727-100, N467 US, became a focal point on the afternoon of November 24th, 1971. It was Thanksgiving Eve, a day of relatively light air traffic, which, ironically, facilitated the rapid coordination of authorities. As Flight 305 hovered in a holding pattern over Puget Sound, nearly 24 miles from Seattle, the logistical drama on the ground unfolded in controlled panic. The FBI had been notified. Special Agent in Charge, C.L. Pimlott, initiated the most complex record-time ransom operation ever seen. Cooper's requirement for $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, in random, non-sequential packaging, was a tactic to hinder any future tracking, but it imposed a frantic race against the clock for Seattle banks. In less than 2 hours, 3 financial institutions were emptied of their reserves in used bills. The total of 10,000 $20 bills was taken to the FBI field office, where each bill was individually photographed, front and back, on microfilm. A raw forensic database, created in haste, would be the investigators' only lifeline. The final weight of the ransom, packed in a canvas bag, was nearly 10.5 kilograms. While the city mobilized aboard the 727, Cooper maintained absolute control with a disarming calm. His description was now consolidated in the agency's records. A man in his 40s, 6 feet tall, wearing a dark executive suit, white shirt, black tie, and dark glasses. He ordered a bourbon and soda, paid the bill, and even tipped the flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, reinforcing the strange dichotomy of his persona, a courteous skyjacker. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the aircraft. His technical questions about cruising speed, flap configuration, and landing gear capacity indicated familiarity, perhaps training, with commercial jets, especially the Boeing 727, notorious for its retractable rear staircase, the air stair, which would become the central axis of his plan. At 5:39 p.m., in the dark, cold twilight of the northwest, the plane finally landed at SeaTac International Airport. Cooper was inflexible. No approach by fuel trucks or service vehicles, only the delivery of the money and parachutes. He demanded that the cockpit curtains be closed and ordered the passenger cabin lights to remain off to obscure any observation by a sniper team or FBI agents who might be on the airport periphery. The exchange was carried out under the gaze of dozens of invisible agents. A Northwest Orient employee approached the aircraft with the bag of money and the parachutes. 2 Navy surplus models, one of which was inoperable, a calculated move by the FBI to increase the chance of a fatal error. Cooper, inspecting the items with a professional eye, quickly dismissed the 36 passengers, keeping only the essential crew: Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratazak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. The second act of the hijacking began. Cooper instructed Scott on the flight plan and non-negotiable operating conditions. They were to fly south toward Mexico City, but only to refuel in Reno, Nevada. The speed should not exceed 170 knots, the maximum altitude 10,000 feet, and the flaps should remain at 15 degrees. Most crucially, the cabin should remain unpressurized throughout the flight. These specifications were unusual, designed not for flight safety, but for the convenience of an escape. The low altitude and reduced speed would ensure that the jump was physically and technically feasible. The clock read 7:40 p.m. when Flight 305 took off from SeaTac, now a ghost plane carrying a treasure and a criminal preparing to become a footnote in aviation history. The total darkness of winter swallowed the 727. The FBI and the Air Force sent F-106 fighter jets to discreetly monitor the aircraft, flying high above where their lights would not be noticed by the cabin. In the air, Cooper tied the canvas bag with the money around his waist, using nylon cords from the reserve parachutes. He put on one of the main parachutes, ignoring the intentional defect placed by the agents. Then, with the help of Flight Attendant Mucklow, he went to the rear of the aircraft. The sound of the wind was deafening. In Molo p.m., over the airspace covering southwestern Washington state, probably near the Columbia River, Cooper lowered the 727's rear staircase. The last glimpse the crew had of him was the dark silhouette of a man in the doorway. He lit what appeared to be a cigarette or cigar, a final gesture of defiance. At 8:13 p.m., a warning light on the cockpit control panel indicated that the air stair had fully opened. The 170-knot wind whipped the fuselage. Sometime between 8:13 p.m. and 8:15 p.m., in the cold, moonless clouds, Dan Cooper, or whoever he was, jumped into the absolute darkness. The money, the parachutes, and the man, all evaporated over the impenetrable forests of the region, leaving behind a plain of microfilmed paperwork and a mystery that would endure for decades. The sudden depressurization, the deafening noise, and the silence that followed were the only evidence the 727 crew had that the threat was over. Without Cooper, the Boeing became a shot-up but functional aircraft. The pilot, William Scott, continued the route to Reno, Nevada, where authorities awaited in feverish anxiety. The traumatized crew carried out the rest of the hijackers' plan, operating the plane like an empty machine heading south. The landing occurred at 1:15 a.m., more than 5 hours after taking off from Seattle. The aircraft, cold and dark, was immediately surrounded by armed FBI agents. What followed was an immediate and exhaustive forensic sweep. Inside the now silent passenger cabin, agents found the tangible remnants of D.B. Cooper's presence: 8 latent fingerprints on the table and the back of seat 18C, a thin black tie clip, a cheap mother-of-pearl tie tack, and cigarette butts. The FBI catalogued these items as the only chance to identify the fugitive. But the tie was generic, and the fingerprints would never be matched to the vast criminal file of the time. The aircraft also contained the 2 parachutes Cooper had rejected. One of them, as planned by the agents, was unusable, stitched to fail, but Cooper did not choose it. He put on one of the operational parachutes, proving that, if he wasn't an experienced parachutist, he at least had a basic knowledge of equipment selection, a detail that fueled the theory that he was a military man or an aviation enthusiast. The FBI, under the command of Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, faced a colossal logistical and geographical problem. They knew the jump had occurred in the misty area of southwestern Washington, but the aircraft's speed, 170 knots, and the high-altitude atmospheric winds made the potential landing area impossibly vast, stretching over hundreds of square miles of wilderness, canyons, and the Cascade Mountains. The search operation, codenamed Jump Center, mobilized the Air Force, the National Guard, and thousands of volunteers. The initial area of interest centered around Ariel, Washington, near Lake Merwin and the Columbia River, a region known for its humid, temperate forests and towering trees over 50 meters high. The time of year was cruel. Late November brought freezing rain, thick fog, strong winds, and temperatures that drastically decreased the chances of survival for a parachutist jumping at night, without adequate thermal protection, at 10,000 feet of altitude. Investigators worked under the grim assumption that if Cooper had survived the parachute opening at 170 knots, the impact against the ground in that unforgiving topography, possibly falling into tall trees or icy waters, would be fatal. The search therefore quickly turned into a treasure hunt, where the prize would be the $200,000 and perhaps a corpse. For 5 years, Operation Jump Center continued, exploring every valley, every stream, every piece of aircraft wreckage dating back to old accidents. Nothing. Neither the body, nor the money, nor the parachute, nor even the slightest evidence that someone had landed in those forests. The mystery of D.B. Cooper was not just about a plane robbery, but about the impunity and effectiveness of a perfect plan. The incident led to the immediate reformulation of aviation safety standards, resulting in the mandatory installation of a simple yet vital device on all Boeing 727s. The Cooper vane. This aerodynamic deflector prevented the rear stairs, the so-called air stairs, from being lowered during flight. From 1972 onwards, the rear door of the 727, the door through which Cooper jumped into myth, was permanently sealed in mid-flight, ensuring that no one would ever repeat that method of escape. While the FBI faced a humiliating investigative failure, Cooper became a cultural icon, an audacious anti-hero who had fooled the system and escaped the law in the dark clouds. Time passed, and Case 305 was just a specter in criminal history, a frustrating footnote. Until, in February 1980, almost 10 years after the jump, the forest finally decided to return part of its secret. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on vacation with his family along the muddy bank of the Columbia River, at a location known as Tina Bar, near Vancouver, Washington, approximately 30 kilometers west of Cooper's original flight path. While digging in the sand, the child found 3 deteriorated packages of $20 bills. The money was almost disintegrated, tied with rubber bands, and partially buried under a thick layer of silt. The discovery was immediately reported to the FBI. The silt had preserved the bills in a strange way, but the serial numbers were unmistakable. They corresponded exactly to the $200,000 paid to D.B. Cooper a decade earlier. The deposition in 1980, 9 years after the jump, coincided with a river dredging cycle carried out by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Large sections of the Columbia River bed are regularly dredged to maintain navigation, and investigators raised the grim hypothesis that Cooper's money could have been unearthed from the river bottom by one of these machines, and deposited in a new area, or simply swept away by the current after being displaced from its original hiding place in the silt. This completely reoriented Cooper's most likely landing zone. The original search area, Jump Center, located in the Ley Center quadrant, now seemed less probable. If the money traveled nearly 30 kilometers downstream to Tina Bar, the point of entry into the water, or a nearby tributary, should be further north or east, perhaps near the Washougal River, a tributary notorious for its strong currents and proximity to the Cascade Mountains. The implication was clear. Cooper not only landed off the initial map, but possibly landed in an aquatic environment, or very close to it, almost immediately after landing. The landing enigma took on a more fatalistic dimension. The money packages were too heavy to float on their own. They would have sunk quickly, suggesting that the force of the water had to be incredibly strong to move them and deposit them in the sand. The absence of the rest of the money, the parachutes, or any trace of Cooper solidified the idea that the rest of the loot and the hijacker himself were likely trapped somewhere in the muddy bottom of the Columbia, a vast and impenetrable aquatic cemetery. The Cooper case cooled again, but now with the bitter certainty that the money was real and that the escape, if successful, had ended in the icy waters of the Pacific Northwest. The FBI kept the case active for 2 more decades, meticulously processing hundreds of new tips and investigating suspects based on the new geographical coordinates suggested by the Tina Bar discovery. In 2007, the American Department of Justice made a final public appeal using the residual evidence from the 70s. They sought information about the asbestos tape used on the reserve parachute that Cooper did not take. This tape, an unusual material to be found on civilian or military parachutes of the time, indicated that Cooper might have had access to a very specific supply, perhaps linked to specialized brake or aeronautical industries. The hope was that someone, after decades of silence, would recognize the detail and connect the final dot. No conclusive lead emerged. The money found, a third of a life worth of loot, remained as a totem corroded by water and time. A physical reminder that the crime had occurred, but that the criminal had dissolved into history. In 2016, after 45 years of continuous investigation, the FBI officially announced that it was suspending the active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case. The files, spanning hundreds of thousands of pages and evidence, would be preserved, but federal resources would be reallocated. The man who jumped from a 727 with $200,000 was no longer a threat, but a permanent shadow in the depths of the Columbia River. He had become the only bandit to disappear into the air, only to resurface, in part, as silt and rotten paper a decade later. The mystery had won. The formal suspension of the hunt did not mean the closure of the mystery, but rather the transfer of the investigation from the federal domain to the eternal pantheon of American folklore. The FBI left behind a crater of unresolved evidence, but also a meticulous forensic record of everything the hijacker left behind in the Boeing 727 cabin. Agents had meticulously catalogued every fiber, every tobacco crumb, and, crucially, a small metallic tie clip left on seat 18C. This object, a common black JCPenney clip, is a detail as banal as it is significant. It suggests a man trying to quickly put together a serious businessman look, a disguise perhaps. But the most intriguing material was the asbestos tape. Analysis of the tape revealed traces of brake dust and magnesium, materials associated with heavy mechanical workshops or military aeronautical maintenance bases. This clue, isolated from the loot and the body, became the new focus of independent investigators who inherited the search. In the years following the 2016 suspension, the true obsession of the D.B. Cooper case became definitive identification, no longer the recovery of the money. Attention turned to a handful of final suspects whose lives post-mortem or otherwise seemed to fit the residual fragments of the psychological profile. A former paratrooper with an electronics background, a Vietnam War veteran, and access to military identification codes. One of these late targets, driving decades of speculation, was Robert Rackstraw, a former Army helicopter pilot with explosives training and a stained disciplinary record that included fraud and desertion. Rackstraw had a history of dangerous maneuvers and an intimate familiarity with aviation. Rackstraw's profile resonated with the audacity required for the crime. He was not just a common criminal. He had the training to plan the flight route, calculate the speed of approach to the ground in the Columbia River Canyon, and understand the mechanics of the 727's rear staircase, a crucial detail that only Air Force or Boeing personnel mastered at the time. The strength of the Rackstraw theory lay in circumstantial evidence. His geographical location, his disappearance after 1971, and mainly, his apparent familiarity with the technical jargon used during the hijacking, such as the precision in describing the plane's flap configurations. However, Rackstraw, who was interviewed several times over the years, firmly denied any involvement, always remaining on the margins of direct proof, protected by the statute of limitations and the lack of forensic evidence linking him to the objects left on the aircraft. Cooper's ambiguity is his legacy. The hijacker who managed the feat of stealing $200,000 without firing a shot became an unlikely hero for a generation disillusioned with governmental authority and the chaos of Vietnam. He was not a violent bank robber, but an ingenious anti-hero who, in fact, beat the system. The money from Tina Bar, the serialized bills, did not prove who he was, only where the story had ended. What remains 50 years later is a cold analysis of the engineering of the crime. The pressure at the moment of the jump, the wind gusts over the aerial Washington area on the night of November 24, 1971, and the statistical probability of survival. If he survived the initial fall into the dense, cold forests of the Cascade Range, where the temperature was near zero and visibility non-existent, he would have had to navigate an unforgiving and swampy terrain. The search for Cooper ended, but the anatomy of his disappearance remains an open dossier on human fallibility and the omnipotence of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. The money, corroded by the silt, spoke volumes about the destructive force of the Columbia. The asbestos tape, the tie clip, and the meticulous details of the reserve parachute remain in the hands of the FBI, mute artifacts of a crime without a body and without a solution. He may have perished in 1971, but D.B. Cooper, the architect of the only successful skyjacking in American history, became immortal as the Houdini of the skies. The shadow in the depths of the river was never lifted. The Norjack investigation, the code name given by the FBI to the Cooper case, consumed the agency's resources on an unprecedented scale. More than 800 suspects were formally investigated over the decades. The frustration of the agents was palpable. They scoured every square mile of the dense Douglas fir jungle in the estimated jump area east of Air Route Victor 23. The geography itself was Cooper's most effective accomplice. While the legend grew in bars and headlines, the FBI worked with the raw material of the man they hoped to capture, the objects left behind in Seat 18C. The Benson and Curtis tie clip, made of copper and zinc alloy with 14-karat gold plating, became the quietest of protagonists. It was a style sold in department stores in the mid-60s. Associated with it, a fragment of asbestos tape. In the 70s, this tape was commonly used for repairs in chemical or aerospace industries, suggesting a possible occupation for the hijacker, perhaps a mechanic or someone with access to heavy industrial environments. Mitochondrial DNA analysis did not provide an unequivocal match, only profiles that could exclude most of the population, but which were insufficient to incriminate the main suspects, including Kenneth Christensen or Rackstraw himself. Time and contamination had diluted the most vital evidence. Cooper's choice of parachutes is a crucial point of contention. The FBI noted that, although he demonstrated tactical knowledge by demanding the Boeing 727, a plane with a retractable rear staircase, a feature that would be removed from future models precisely because of this incident, he was careless or purposefully misleading in his equipment selection. Of the 4 parachutes delivered to him, he used 2 main parachutes, ignoring a reserve parachute that was an obsolete training model, sealed in 1967, and worse, non-functional. If Cooper was the aviation expert his demand suggested, he would have noticed the incorrectly stitched ripcord. The choice may indicate desperation, haste, or more disturbingly for investigators, the intention to deliberately discard useless equipment to confuse the search, knowing he only needed one effective main chute. D.B. Cooper's most tangible legacy does not lie in the dusty FBI files, but in the very engineering of commercial aviation. The hijacking was an outrage to air safety that demanded an immediate response. In 1972, the Federal Aviation Administration implemented the rule requiring the installation of the Cooper vane. This device, a simple aerodynamic fin, was fixed to the rear door, the ventral door, of the Boeing 727. Its function was purely physical. When the plane reached speeds above 150 knots, the force of the air locked the Cooper vane, making it impossible to open the stairs. It was a cold, industrial admission that Cooper's plan was perfectly replicable, but that it would never be successfully repeated. The irony remains. The man who flew into the cold night with a briefcase full of money, leaving no definitive trace of his identity, forced the air world to permanently close itself off. He proved that the security of the skies had a blind spot, and its correction cost Boeing millions. 50 years of silence from the Pacific Northwest confirmed that he disappeared from the map. Whether to a tropical paradise financed by the robbery, or to an anonymous cold grave in the dense, humid roots of the forest. The Cooper case is not about who he was, but about how he managed to untie the knots of order and vanish, leaving behind only the legend of a man in an executive coat and dark glasses who defied gravity and the law and apparently won. The file remains open, more out of historical stubbornness than forensic hope. But the mystery continues. Do you think Cooper survived the jump, or is his final resting place beneath the cold waters of the Columbia River? Let us know your theory in the comments below. If you want more deep dive analyses into the world's most enduring true crime and historical secrets, make sure you subscribe to the Archive Mind and turn on notifications. We unravel the past, one file at a time. Thank you for watching.